I have 5 speakers here present. It is going to be the energy component of this is something that always gets a hot debate over carbon footprint and emissions, rest of it. And oftentimes it seems that irreconcilable differences dominate the field pretty much, even though that might have changed over the last couple of years. Nevertheless, we have Juho Lipponen here. He is representing International Energy Agency, am I right? And you're acting head for the Energy Technology Policy Division, head of the Carbon Capture and Storage Technology Unit. Sounds extremely complicated, sir, but you'll have the opportunity to explain that to us, or to me. I mean, everyone else is an energy expert, so no problem with that. In any case, Juho, nice to see you here. Kevin Johnson is here as well. He works with the Nordic Council of Ministers, if I understand correctly, with the Nordic Energy Research. He's advisor there, so and has researched the whole idea about energy decarbonization of the Baltic states, so we'll hear from that as well. Great. We have a Lithuanian representative, Daumantas Kerežis. Daumantas, a warm welcome to you as well, representing Ministry of Energy of Lithuania, where he's advisor, International Cooperation and Planning Division. We have an Estonian friend over there as well, Georg Rute, representing energy company, Elering, and we have Andrejs Apanyuks, representing the Ministry of Economy of Latvia, where he's Deputy Director of Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Okay, dear friends, the thing is, I'll look into my, so it's 35. We've got an hour and 10 minutes, and we've got 5 presentations from you. So it's pretty much 10 minutes. Is that something that you are prepared? And then we have a bit of time left to discuss things. And actually questions have already been coming in the first session as well. And a couple of people have come up to me saying, I'm not sure I want to talk, but do please ask this or that. And I'll try to do that. So I will shut up right now and give Juho Lipponen here the opportunity to speak. And he'll talk to us about catalyzing energy technology transformations. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edis, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak at this event. So I'm from the IEA, and the IEA looks at the energy system issues, energy markets, energy technologies from a, should we say, always a global perspective and a rather holistic perspective. So I hope I can bring some interesting reference points from let's say around the world to the Baltic discussion. And if I go over the 10 minutes, start throwing things at me or something, so I know to stop. So catalyzing energy technology transformations is the topic of the talk, and that's actually a subtitle of a recent book the IEA put out earlier in the year, which is called the Energy Technology Perspectives. And that is an analysis that we do every year, looking at how various energy technologies evolve and how can we use them to reach some rather ambitious climate goals. So let's go through some of these thoughts from the ETP 2017. Some starting points here. I think we all know that the energy markets, energy sector is really changing as we speak. Just a few examples here. I mean, renewable energy supplied half of the global power demand growth in 2016. So more than fossil fuels together came from renewables in terms of additional demand in 2016. We also improved our energy intensity, and certain sectors enjoyed tremendous positive development, such as the electric car sector, where sales were up 40%, and we reached 2 million electric cars on the roads globally. So that's a new record year, a new milestone that was hit. So we're witnessing change as we speak. However, a lot needs to be and remains to be done. The energy sector really is key to sustainable economic growth. We have major aspects of supply security, and on the level of individuals, this translates really into the area of energy access. We still have over 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity on a daily basis, and nearly 3 billion people who don't have clean cooking facilities. And these are major challenges that need to be dealt with, mostly in Asia, in sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere as well. The energy sector is the largest greenhouse gas emitter. As we know, 2/3 of global greenhouse gases come from the energy sector. But also there are clear health issues. These were also mentioned by some of the earlier speakers today. The energy sector is linked to 6.5 million premature deaths every year, according to World Health Organization, due to the air pollution that comes from energy transformation. And perhaps the third point there is that there isn't one single story. We cannot think that every country would do their new or their energy transition and transformation in the similar way. It will have to be done according to local, regional circumstances. Energy-related CO2 emissions have grown in the past decades. A somewhat positive sign is that in the past 3 years, they've actually seemed to stabilize into the area of 34 gigatons per year. And that's obviously good news. We don't know whether that trend continues. Actually, in our scenarios, we don't think it quite does, but that is certainly a good sign and shows that energy policy and strong energy policy can have an impact. But this is where we need to go. We need to more than halve the energy-related CO2 emissions in the coming decades to be on any type of a 2-degree scenario compatible CO2 emissions. So there's a long road ahead. If we then look at the clean energy technologies and how they are progressing, and that's one part of the Energy Technology Perspectives book that was put out. But this we do also every year. It's an exercise where we look at how technologies progress against a 2-degree scenario goal. And you can put energy technologies or groups of technologies, there's altogether nearly 30 of them that we look at. But if you group them in different groups, we throw them in 3 distinct buckets. They are those that are nowhere near to be on track. More efficient coal-fired power stations. I mean, in 2016, 1/3 of new coal-fired power stations were still subcritical power stations, things that should not be built anymore, and yet they are being built. Carbon capture and storage was mentioned as well, where we do see some progress, but we're way off the mark of being on track to delivering a 2-degree outcome. Then we do have technologies that have seen good progress and have accelerated. They're not necessarily on that 2-degree pathway yet, but where there's been positive signs. We've had a very strong growth in nuclear in the past couple of years. Light-duty vehicle fuel economy has increased. Various aspects of energy efficiency standards have really kicked in lighting and appliances and the building sector, where the carbon footprint of bringing new appliances, new technology in has been far lessened. And then, luckily, there are a number of technologies that seem to be on track, that are progressing well. Solar PV and onshore wind. These were already mentioned by a couple of earlier speakers. Also energy storage, the non-pumped hydro storage, but battery and other types of technologies are growing from a very low base, but there's been tremendous growth in the past years. And electric vehicles, so 2 million electric cars on the roads as of last year. Here's a little snapshot of the electric vehicle development. So we've gone past the 2 million cars. We see that this is actually currently a story of a relatively small number of countries. China really stepped up in 2016, became by far the largest electric vehicle country, followed by the US, Japan, and then Norway and various other countries as well. But we do need to grow and expand the electric vehicle fleet elsewhere as well, and also keep the foot on the accelerator in terms of policies that support them, because the growth in electric vehicles, even if we pass the 2 million car mark, the growth seems to have some signs of slowing down. Solar PV and onshore wind are also progressing extremely well. We're all aware of the tremendous cost reductions that we've seen in both areas, perhaps the solar PV being the case in point. And if we contrast the historical development, our short-term forecasts, and then the targets where we think we'd need to be on a 2-degree pathway, we think that solar PV and onshore wind are also performing extremely well and are on track. That's a good thing. A short note on low carbon power is, however, that solar PV and wind alone are not enough to keep the low carbon power, renewable power on track alone. So we do need to get the other low carbon power sources on the same track as well. I won't dwell more on this one. Another interesting point is that what are we doing with developing technology, developing new solutions? The amount of R&D inputs into clean energy has been relatively constant in the past few years, in the area of 26 to 28 billion US dollars per year. And you see much of that has been from the public purse and much smaller portion from private. That is very small compared to R&D inputs in some other sectors. Just contrasting that with the R&D inputs of 3 IT majors, which in this case are Amazon, Google, and Intel. Their combined R&D inputs in 1 year alone were way higher than the global clean energy research inputs were. And so I think it puts in perspective the fact that clean energy isn't getting enough of the R&D inputs from governments or industry at the moment. There is a organization called Mission Innovation that was launched at the COP21 in Paris, where over 20 countries have pledged to double their clean energy R&D inputs. And if they do, then we might reach a similar level than just the 3 top IT companies are doing at the moment. So we do need to put emphasis on the R&D and innovation spending. Finishing with forward-looking stuff. In this ETP book, we asked ourselves that how far can currently known technologies and technologies that we know might develop within historically seen trends, where might they take us in terms of CO2 emission reductions? Now, our reference technology scenario is a scenario where countries would put in place their current promises and pledges that they made at COP21 and elsewhere as well. And that, we think, will lead to a little bit of a growth on energy-related CO2 emissions going forward, but kind of a stabilization 2040 onwards. This is the pathway where we ought to be in a 2-degree scenario. So we need to dramatically reduce the CO2 emissions. It goes back to one of the earlier slides. IEA does optimization work. We look at how different technologies would work in a portfolio in an economically optimal way. Energy efficiency and renewable energy are clearly the 2 most important vectors in in our CO2 reduction efforts going forward, followed by nuclear fuel switching, and then what was also already mentioned earlier, carbon capture and storage, which in certain applications, certain industries, is the only way to really dramatically reduce emissions. And that's the difference from reference technology scenario to a 2-degree scenario. Now, if we really push the technology envelope and went beyond 2 degrees, we might be able to reach carbon neutrality by roughly 2060, but we would really need to push all of these technologies way further. And again, CCS would be an important technology in really tackling those sticky emissions at the sort of higher end of the cost scale. So we need them all, and none of these technologies really is a silver bullet. And the one last point from ETP and from the IEA work in general is that we cannot look at anything in a vacuum. System integration, energy system thinking really is the essential point in the future. And none of the parts of the energy sector cannot just be looked in an isolation. They need to be planned and looked at as a whole. And I'll finish with that picture. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Do not throw away that presentation. I had a quick follow-up question on one of the slides that you showed. Can we put it on? One of the like a third one, I think, where you showed you grouped together different technologies on. Okay. So I had a question about how this underperforming. This one. So they're not on track because they cannot, or they have not just achieved the maturity, or the technology is not there, but it is feasible to achieve that being on track, or is it more or less lethal for some of those technologies?
None of these technologies are immature in the sense that you would not be able to deploy them. So it really is a policy question rather than technical question. In some respects, it could also be, should we say, risk-sharing question. But it's not a question that, for example, carbon capture and storage, we wouldn't have the technology to push it. We do. It's expensive, yes, but it's there. Okay. So these are all technologies that can go forward, and essentially due to lacking policy, they haven't moved forward.
Okay, good. Thank you for clearing that up. Thank you very much. Good. We'll come back to, I think, a couple of points you raised there as we go on. Kevin, can I ask you to the podium there? So you did study the challenge of energy decarbonization in the Baltic states in particular. So we're very keen to hear what your conclusions are. Please.
Well, we are studying the energy decarbonization in the Baltic states. As mentioned, my name is Kevin Johnson. I work for Nordic Energy Research as an advisor, and I am the project coordinator of a project we call Baltic Energy Technology Scenarios, or BENTE for short. And so first of all, Nordic Energy Nordic Energy Research. Who are we? Well, we are an organization based in Oslo under the auspices of Nordic Council of Ministers. We are about 14 employees, and our role or mission is to analyze, evaluate, and fund research on the Nordic energy system, but also to look at the Baltic energy system and enforce Baltic-Nordic cooperation. And just to take a bit of history behind the project, it was real nice that you presented the ETP, because one of the reasons we are doing the BENTE project is that we have been doing this Nordic Energy Technology Perspectives series with the latest issue last year, where we looked at the Nordic energy system. We went from the global overview that was shared here to looking at how would the regional perspectives be in such a study, and we did it in close cooperation with IEA and also other Nordic research facilities. And on the background of that work, we decided that we wanted to look at other areas than the central Nordic areas. So we started this year with a project called EVA, energy in the West Nordics to look at Greenland, Iceland, Svalbard, etc. And we also started BENTE, Baltic Energy Technology Scenarios, which I will be talking about today. So, as I mentioned, we are still working on it. So all the results I will present will be preliminary results. We have basically finished the research questions, the scenario definitions, the input data, and we are working on how to structure our models, and we're getting the draft results from that. Then we will build a public data set based on all the input information and all the results. And we will also have a final report ready in the end of January. So that's kind of how the schedule is. If we're looking at the general framework, to do this study, we contracted two consultancies, VTT from Finland and EA Energy Analysis from Denmark. And they each have energy model they use in this project. We have Times VTT and Balmoral. And while Times VTT looks at more or less all energy emissions, Balmoral digs into the power and heat sector. And compared to the other studies that could be relevant, for example, the EU Commission modeling, you can see that what we don't do is model the land use change in forestry emissions or negative emissions. So that's kind of the scope of the study. And what we did was to define three scenarios. One is the 4-degree scenario, or the business as usual. One is a Baltic policy scenario, where the EU in general develops in a 2-degree scenario, but where the Baltic states try to reach their own policy goals or targets. And we have the 2-degree scenario, which is a more cost-optimized scenario, trying to reach 2 degrees in 2050. And as has been mentioned many times here today, it's important to keep in mind that the systems we are looking at are quite different, especially Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia from Lithuania, Latvia. And you can see that almost all of the emissions in Estonia are related to the ETS, while Lithuania and Latvia have most of the emissions in the ESD, mostly from agriculture and transportation. So this is just to keep in mind that even though, at least me from Norway, often think of the Baltic countries as pretty similar, you see that it's actually quite different. And what we are doing, I'm going to present talk about three targets that we're going to look into, and keep in mind that they're preliminary, so they will change. But we have been looking at the ESD emission targets, and in this figure you can see the targets marked in crosses, the most likely, or the 4-degree scenario, marked in dots, and then we have the Baltic policy scenario in the squares. And what we find in our preliminary analysis is that there are likely not necessary to have additional measures in Estonia or Lithuania to be within the targets, but Latvia will need additional measures. But you can also see that both Estonia and Lithuania are getting quite close to the targets. So even though it might not be necessary, there should be some measures in place that could be taken in place if some of our assumptions prove to be wrong in reality, or if the development develops differently than we see. So keep that in mind. Where we could do additional measures, and we find it to be most cost efficient, is in the building sector, where you could increase the building efficiency. It's in moving from fossil fuels to electricity or to biofuels. And it is in waste management, where you can, for example, use waste to heat or waste to biogas used in transportation, as two examples. We also looked at the renewable energy targets in the Baltic countries. We are still working on the Latvian renewable energy share, so I'm just going to show you Estonia and Lithuania here. And here you can see the dotted lines are the targets, and you see that both the Baltic policies scenario and the 4 degrees and the 2-degree scenario are quite in line, at least until 2030. Actually, you see that the Baltic policies will build out more renewable energy than needed in a 2-degree scenario. So it might, in a Baltic policy scenario, it will probably be built out more renewable energy in the Baltic countries than what would be most cost efficient, at least in our analysis. And why would you do that? Well, maybe to increase the energy dependency. So there are good reasons to do that as well. And for Lithuania especially, you see that if you're going to reach the domestic electricity production target, it's only in the Baltic policy scenario where you increase the renewable energy production a lot, and you reach that target. We will also look into energy efficiency targets, but that's still a work in progress. It will not be on the specific measures needed, but it will be an overview of how will, for instance, the overall energy efficiency of the system develop when you move from fossil fuel transport to electric transportation. So that's what we're going to do here. And so to the preliminary conclusions. The Baltic states are on a feasible path to the 2030 energy targets, but there are some policy needed. The Baltic states are in need of stronger policies on renewable energy to reach the Baltic's own 2030 targets. And the Baltic states need to decarbonize electricity supply and electrify other sectors to stay on a 2-degree pathway. But remember, these are the preliminary results. So the results will change, and what we emphasize in this study will probably change as well. But I welcome any questions, and I look forward to present the final results in January. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I mean, you're no final results, so it's quite convenient for you to, to avoid questions that you might, dislike. But nevertheless, I think we will come back to a couple of points, particularly if you're coming to this conclusion that stronger policies are needed, and particularly in Latvian case, decarbonization of electricity supply, was it? Then maybe there are some scenarios or maybe more specific recommendations that you could do. But let's leave that for a moment. Okay, good. Let's move on with Daumantas Kerežis on Lithuanian Ministry of Energy, and Daumantas will tell us what is the Lithuanian pathway towards 2050. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Dear participants of the conference, Energy Decarbonization Strategy for Lithuania, 80% renewables in 2050. Let me start my presentation with a question to the audience. A little fact. Last year in Lithuania, the renewables consisted almost 26% of all energy mix. My question to the audience is just about your feeling. What do you think looking at this name? Is it possible to your opinion, or is it complete fantasy? What is your first impressions? Please raise your hands who thinks it's possible. Okay, thank you. And who thinks it's not possible, it's fantasy? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Actually, I'm very happy to hear the other speakers, Kevin Johnson's presentation, because the Bentest study he is working in confirms that we need really such high objectives for 2050. And let me show you one thing. I have specifically looked for a slide from some 7 or 8 years ago, what kind of presentations we were making by the time. And it was like a review of Lithuanian energy sector situation. We were so-called energy islands, Lithuania and also Baltic countries in general. We had no energy market, all by our own. In 2009, Lithuania still had the Ignalina nuclear power plant. We were a net electricity exporter, and in 2010 it was closed already. And as you see, we are extremely dependent on electricity import, and from what I have to stress, from single electricity supplier. The country on the east from here. And do you see a problem here? Do you think we could do anything about that? Well, we did see the problem. We didn't like the picture as you see here, because we paid the highest price for gas in Europe. The electricity prices were high, and so we decided that we have to change something. And this maybe could be called a guidebook. In 2012, we have introduced a renewed energy independence strategy with a stress by the time, a stress on energy independence or security, in other words, to build some strategic energy projects and to end the situation I have shown you it was like a strategic triangle. Competitiveness and sustainability was also there. But what happened in 2017? I can say that this situation has changed a lot, because now we have alternatives. We have alternative interconnections of electricity. In Lithuania, we have liquefied natural gas import terminals, so alternative. The prices have dropped. So when in 2010, I couldn't imagine that how it will look like. It looked like a statement on a paper. But my message here that beginning with a strategy, we can change something also already in 5 years. And in 2017, looking at the situation that energy security environment has changed to the positive side, we have also updated the strategy. We have a draft prepared by the Ministry of Energy, and there's a lot more emphasis on green energy. Here is like one more addition to the triangle I have showed you before, because competitiveness is here, security is here, green energy is here. We just put one more: innovations and breakthrough. And I will touch green energy and innovations in my presentation. That's why I have made them like this. And they are actually of the equal importance. I don't want to say that some is more important. In energy security, we still have some things to do, and then other thing will be to sustain the level we reach. There are some things in competitiveness to do, and green energy innovations is up to the 2050. There's a long-term goal. So how can we achieve the vision of 80% renewables? From 26 last year, actually. So of course, you have to develop renewables in a way. And what we see, what we calculate, that wind energy will be most likely will take the biggest share of all renewables in Lithuania. Just to show you a short graph here, but decade by decade in a way that you can see that wind is onshore and offshore, both. Both of them will make the biggest amount. We also expect solar to increase a lot, and also biofuels. Hydro will be there, but not that much due to environmental situation and concerns. And prosumers, yes, in this strategy we do believe that decentralization is the future, that individual households will be able to produce energy for their needs. At this point, what we mean by saying prosumers is that people are able to produce electricity from their own solar panels, maybe some small wind energy mills, and then in 2030, we expect that 30% of all electricity produced will be produced in decentralized way, and in 2050, 50%. Of course, energy efficiency, and that the primary and final energy intensity would be around 2.4 times lower in 2050 compared to 2017. Of course, efficiency is not a very direct maybe influencer to renewables, but in a way that the energy demand would not grow as much as if not using energy efficiency measures, and if we build more renewable energy sources, the share should rise. And when speaking about energy efficiency, I mean renovation of old apartments. I mean industry, both existing, which would use less energy, and to attract the industry, which in a way is so modern that it doesn't use so much energy to produce better value. And transport. And it's very interconnected with transport fuel transformation. And by this, we mean, on one hand, electricity, electrification. And on the other hand, it's the bio option. Maybe it will be a biogas-based fuels, ordinary biofuels. And in transport, in 2050, we have objective that to reduce 50% of fossil fuel-driven cars in cities. And the second slide, this will be more like a technological way. The previous was like basics, but here is more like technology, what we have included in the strategy, that solutions for energy supply and demand management and consumer behavior change. It's basically about smart digital things. It's smart metering, it's smart grids. It's when the consumers will be able to choose which source to buy electricity from, which time to buy them, and when the renewables will reach the market level, it should be an advantage, and consumers are more likely to choose renewable options. We believe so. Technologies, yes, we do believe in technology progress. Our vision is based a lot on the assumption that there will, in 33 years, technology should like breakthrough, and energy, for example, energy storage and other kinds of technology we don't even imagine will exist, will help us to reach the 80% target of renewables. And center of competence for renewable energy technologies, it is meant that today Lithuania already has some experience in some kinds of renewables, especially in solar panels, because in the country we produce solar panels, and exports, and also in heating sector, in biofuel sector. So we hope to accumulate this knowledge in such centers, and in this way also educate people, staff, and this should also be like additional impetus to 80% renewables target. And it is my last slide here. It's like a general targets of the whole strategy in one slide. It's renewables and final energy consumption, the first slide, district heat supply, transport sector, renewables and electricity, and home production. It has to be noted that 2050 chart is, well, actually a vision. We do understand that. We cannot exactly say which steps do we need for that. Of course, we asked for some modeling also based on assumptions to come up with these numbers. But 2050 is still a vision. And our strategy will be based more on 2030 targets for now, also in conjunction with the European Union energy climate plans and general planning. So I think that's all I could say in my 7-10 minutes, so thank you for attention.
Okay, thank you very much. I have a follow-up question though on the if you could come back to the slide on your targets for 2050. But okay, so it's in the electricity sector, you 2050, it's 80% of renewables, right?
Yes.
In the electricity sector, there have been earlier questions about. Well, to what extent can we practically depart from fossils to ensure stable supply of electricity? So this basically presumes that you can, right? Is the idea basically?
Yes, the idea is so. It's as I have said, we have asked for scientists to model these projections. So in their calculations, using the assumptions they said this kind of mix is possible. Okay. It's possible, but as I said, for 2050, it's really so far away. And in terms of technology for Lithuania, we count mostly on offshore wind, because maybe by 2030 it will be some ready phase deployment. So by 2050, it's the biggest source to be able to reach this number. Without that, then we might need some other technologies to reach 80%.
All right, good. Okay, thank you very much, Domantas, for the presentation. Georg, please, if I could ask you, representing once again the Elering energy company in Estonia, and Georg is going to talk to us about smart energy systems, right? Please.
Yes, thank you. Hello. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon.
There's no presentation for Georg?
There should be a... Well, I can do it without slides. I was going to show you 3 pictures anyway. So I'll do it without those pictures. The first picture was a picture of transmission lines. So you can all imagine large electricity pylons and the cables that you see when you drive around in the country. So that was the first picture. My name is Georg. I'm from the grid operator in Estonia. So in the electricity system, you have producers, you have people who sell electricity, and then you have the organizations that transports electricity. And Elering is the transmission system operator. And I'll talk a little bit about systems, energy systems in particular, that have been mentioned a little bit here already. Because we cannot view production and consumption of electricity in isolation. It has to be seen as a system. So now you can picture the power lines. Traditionally, electricity has been taken from large central power plants to household and industry consumers, from these power lines to smaller cables, eventually into wires in your home. But what's changing is that we're having more and more people who not only consume electricity but also produce electricity. You have more and more prosumers. And in addition to that, electricity is becoming to be used more and more for heating and for transportation as well. So these things are driving quite thorough change in the business of transporting electricity. I would like to, before going on, emphasize a point, which is that the energy liberalization in Europe has meant that the grid operator is a completely neutral party. So 100% of the revenues comes from regulated income. We don't have market interests. So, and the reason for that is that there cannot be a market without the wires connecting to people. You cannot sell electricity if you cannot transport it, and you cannot put electricity in a bag and take it from one house to the other. So the grid makes the market, and because it has this monopoly role, we don't have any market interests, which puts us in the position to enable the transition. We have the physical grid connecting people, but what we need to have in addition, because we cannot store electricity, we need to have electricity balanced in real time. So anything that's being produced this minute has to be consumed this minute. Because it cannot be stored, traditionally what was done to ensure that production and consumption are equal was that in the power operator's offices, somebody would pick up the phone, call the power plant operator and order them to produce a little bit more or a little bit less. But with millions of prosumers, we can't do this anymore. Fortunately, in parallel to the power grid, we have the information grid as well. So most homes, most industry are connected to the internet. And what we see more and more is that the power grid business is also becoming the sort of the digital grid business. Because we are the neutral market party, it is up to us to set the rules and the information systems upon which the buying and selling to ensure the balance is done. So we are building the second grid, which is sort of the ICT grid. And here I had a photo of a server park with lots of servers on it. So you can imagine the hardware that those sort of platforms, digital platforms, run on. So the TSO, the transmission system operator, the grid operator, builds the wires between producers and consumers, and it also sets the rules and makes the markets upon which the real-time purchases and sales are done. And I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing in Estonia in that direction. So I would like to emphasize one more time that the energy systems are becoming joined between power, gas, and heating and transport. So I'll go now to Estonia, and the third picture that was supposed to be on my slides is of a nice lake with a forest in the background with a writing underneath that says Estonia as a digital energy piloting country. And the reason I've written that there, that you can imagine a nice nature scene, is that Estonia is a small country. We have 1 million people, we have a strong IT background. And by being small, we're able to get all the decision makers basically into the sauna at the same time, so people make up their minds and agree to do something. That's why we can make decisions quickly and be a piloting country. So when other people are still deciding what to do, we've gone out and built it and proved that it works. And in this way, we help the collaboration in Europe. We're too small to make too much of a policy impact, but we can show that technology works. So we've already in 2012, we started installing smart meters. By now, we have 100% smart meters in Estonia. And this builds upon the digital government systems that we have already from 15 years ago. And by combining these two things, we have the 100% smart meters in Estonia. All the data is collected into a central database, and energy service companies can access that data with your permissions. If you log in, you select which services you would like, and that service gains access to your energy data. And this, so far, is pretty much unique in Europe. Only Denmark has something similar. And what this allows is, for example, a factory owner can view the actual energy situation in all of their different parts of their factory. They don't have to install additional metering points for that. So that's on the consumer side. We're making data available. In Estonia now we're working with Denmark and other countries to make that data accessible across borders as well. And on the more traditional side of the grid operator business, the real-time balancing, we're now launching together with colleagues in Europe a digital platform that enables prosumers, producers and consumers, to make purchases and sales of electricity centrally, so that on the other side there's the national grid operator and also distribution grid operator, so that if there's a power line somewhere in Estonia that's about to be overloaded because of too much solar power, for example, then the distribution system can pay those solar grids to consume less or pay somebody else to consume more on that street. So we're combining local flexibility with national needs, and now we're aiming to work together with our European partners to make at least to be part of the European balancing. So we see the local to international scale combined. So Estonia is the digital piloting country for new technologies, and we want to collaborate. We're looking to collaborate with, very much already collaborating with the Baltic states, and also more widely for effect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if you could, just a quick follow for you. Thank you very much for painting these word pictures. It works even better than the PowerPoint presentation. But so digital energy piloting country you are. And that is built on the perception that we saw in the Lithuanian story as well, that you see the prosumer side of the production as well increasing significantly in the overall share of energy production, right? So what would be your expectation of how far it could go and what amount of time?
Well, Estonia has a lot of historic power generation at the moment, and there will still be there for years. What our position at Elering is that we want to remove any barriers on the market for prosumers to arrive. So if somebody wants to build solar panels on the roof, they should have the ability to sell that to the markets that have the most value. Now, in terms of actual numbers of how many what percentage of energy production should be from a type of energy, that's not Ellering's business. We make the market rules, but we don't choose technologies. So for the actual number of the amount of solar panels in Estonia, I'd refer to the colleagues who've modeled this.
Okay, good stuff. Well, thank you very much for this food for thought. As oftentimes the Estonians do give us food for thought about pioneering certain things, and I think it sort of connects well with a lot of things that have been said already. Well, thank you very much. Interesting. I'm looking forward to comments from the audience as well. Andrejs Apanyuks, we have here representing the Ministry of Economy of Latvia. And Andrejs will tell us the story about where we are and what we strive for in Latvia in this regard. Please.
Sveicināts. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I will speak in Latvian. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference. As I listened to the previous speakers and from my experience in similar events, where we think about energy sector as such, often we hear that Estonia is very ambitious over the long term. The situation is similar in Lithuania, and as we heard today, Lithuania is quite ambitious as regards renewable energy by 2030 and 2050, and its production and consumption. When it comes to Latvia, we are currently one of the leading states in the EU as regards the end consumption of renewable energy. At the same time, we are currently working on our long-term goals and strategies. Why this is so? It's because there are several aspects to be considered. First of all, our historical experience, statistics, indicators on how our policy, the transformation of our energy sector, what was the basis, what were the costs. We also need to consider the context, which is quite significant player. We heard about technology. We heard about the opening of energy markets, about integration, and Kevin talked about the Bente project, on how the Nordics and the Baltics could integrate and cooperate in energy matters. Of course, also the context of the European Union, which is one of the great helpers, has helped very much in the past and will certainly continue to support us in the future. We didn't talk so much about emission reduction as such, although in principle reduction of emissions is the overall objective, and everything else follows from it. This renewable energy goals, infrastructure goals, etc. In the case of Latvia, if we look back on our history and look at the most important segments, in the 90s, renewable energy was only energy produced in hydroelectric plants. Currently, from all of electricity, about 2/3 is produced by hydroelectric plants. The rest is energy created from biomass or biogas. We also have more wind energy used in Latvia. And heat energy, in the 90s, we mostly used fossil fuel. When we think about central heating, we used mostly, as I said, fossil fuels, but these days we are approaching the threshold that will allow us to say that we are shifting towards renewable energy in this area as well. So things are happening. If we focus on emissions, then as Kevin showed in his presentation, in Estonia, the overall picture between the ETS and non-ETS emissions means that the trade sector creates the biggest emissions, while the situation reverse in Latvia and Lithuania. If energy creates about 1/3 of emissions, and when we consider the non-ETS sector, meaning stationary energy, not including transport, then we have around 18%. Over time, through the implementation of EU fund programs and implementing other renewable energy support programs, we have managed to reduce our emissions. In this planning period, we have the so-called support programs for increasing energy efficiency of residential buildings, heat systems and their upgrades, and also in industry and production. Our assessments show that when we use these funds, we will be able to reduce the amount of emissions by about 1 percentage point. One essential thing is the big pie here is the non-ETS emissions. Through the implementation of energy efficiency measures for residential buildings, we are solving this ETS problem in Latvia. Since these equipment that generate energy are working in the ETS sector. Another interesting thing which could provide an additional reduction by 1 percentage point, where we have to consider what we will do in the future. Insulation of buildings is very well, but considering the rates, so 1,000 buildings during every planning period, that is not enough, since we have about 20,000 buildings that should be insulated. That is a question on how to improve this particular segment of the market. So we're thinking about energy service company market, how to facilitate and promote it. This is currently something we are working on. A little bit about the EU level. Maybe you heard also about the energy union. Here, by 2030, we need to lay out our long-term energy policy, and it consists of several dimensions. One is decarbonization, that includes energy efficiency, renewable energy, energy security, energy market, as well as research and development. And all of these blocks are interlinked. I'm saying this because by the end of next year, we have to draft our national climate and energy project, meaning all our steps, all the trajectories that will allow us to achieve the goals for 2030. In energy efficiency and renewable energy, on the national level, there are no binding goals foreseen, but we are talking here about EU goals. Currently, we are at a stage where we are outlining our roadmap. In the case of Latvia, this could be a framework document which contains the overall vision for the energy sector. It also includes cooperation with neighboring states and Nordic countries. Another essential element is the BENTEC project, within which we cooperate with our colleagues, and we hope to achieve some significant conclusions on what should be done and what should not be done, and where are the drawbacks. But as we saw in our neighboring states, and as regards emissions, over the long term, they might have less trouble with cutting their emissions. Next, and this is the area that I represent, we have heard about renewable energy. We have seen various reportages on TV. Although we are one of the leading countries as regards the use of renewable energy, there are still evident problems. So since 2012, there are no new authorizations granted for production of renewable energy within the component of the mandatory procurement. What we are doing right now, we are working on the so-called renewable energy concept. This is planned as a concept document which will outline the pathways that we want to take in the future. Not only electrical power, but also heating and the transport. It's quite difficult to cover all of this in a single document, but it's still very important. And this is linked with the BENTE project and the National Climate and Energy Plan. Alongside this, and this was also mentioned by our colleagues, in Latvia we have the net reporting system or net metering system. So in houses where you have, for example, solar panels, the energy can be transferred into the network. The problem is that the energy producers pay the mandatory procurement share for this energy. So this is a trouble issue, how we can solve this particular problem and how we can facilitate development in the future, because there are some industry companies that would like to provide their own energy sources. This is one of the questions that we are looking at right now, and in the near future we are planning some improvements to this system. For this is one of the alternatives on how to facilitate renewable energies without direct supports to specific companies, but these self-consumers might make this area more attractive to households. Problems, as I said, we have some experience in providing support to renewable energy. In the future, we will try to move to a market-regulated situation with a support instrument.
And then we should think how to move the market. So this is the most significant in this respect. So in the nearest half a year, I think there's going to be a discussion held on these topics. And speaking of National Climate and Energy Plan, and the European Union also foreseen that such documents should be discussed publicly, since we undertake long-term commitments, and it's also a roadmap which we should follow later. So by and large, that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this detailed overview of the Latvian situation. We have, by the way, an international panel here, so we probably don't want to go much more into detail about our own efforts to sort of restart our debate on renewables and how to create the system. Right, so we have 10 minutes before we break for coffee. So if anyone wants to get involved with more specific questions, you're welcome to. You can actually use our Slido application as well for this debate here. One question that I had, I don't know who will want to chip in on this, but there are a couple of people in the audience that walked up to me and urged me to ask about the role of nuclear energy in all of this mix. So are there any reflections on that? I mean, the Lithuanians might have something to say on that with their nuclear history and perhaps nuclear future in a sense as well. And here Juho as well might comment how this looks from a very international perspective, and obviously the debate is ongoing. So from the Baltic perspective, a Lithuanian perspective, is there any place for nuclear energy as well in the mix going forward? Is it on?
Looks like.
Yes, it is now on.
Okay, so in my presentation, I think I haven't stressed it enough, but why are we increasing? We want to increase the renewable part to 80% in 2050. It's the very first reason that we want to decarbonize, it's decarbonization efforts. And we believe that for now, renewables is the best alternative for that. Speaking about nuclear in general, of course, it's also known that it's a non-polluting source in sense of CO2 emissions. But yes, in the current strategy, we have not included nuclear energy, but we form our objectives that in 2050, we need the energy sector to be non-pollutant. So it might be so, because the strategy will be revised. It's not like written for until 2050. We need revisions quite often, every 2 years, maybe every 4. If there is some deviations in our path to decarbonization, if we can't reach it with renewables, maybe we will come back to the idea of introducing nuclear. But for now, in this document, it is not included.
Right, good. Juho, please.
Yeah, I think for the IEA, nuclear is definitely part of that low carbon power and energy suite, no question about that. It is very divisive, if you like. There's not every country wants to develop it. Some want to get out of it and rid of it. It has more sort of path dependency than many other low carbon sources, if you like. You need a big government program for it. Usually you need to have institutions and regulators in place to be able to regulate not just the industry expertise. So there's a lot of, it's a, shall we say, a slow moving sector compared with renewables, for example. Now, having said that, I mentioned, I think, in one of the slides that there's been a bit of a surge in nuclear recently, 10 gigawatts or so added in 2016. And if you look at some of the emerging economies, China and India, those would be the countries where that you look at for the future additions. And then everybody who uses nuclear just needs to solve the long-term radioactive waste issue, which hasn't really been solved in most places yet. And that's one of the things that needs to be on the agenda for whoever uses nuclear.
All right. Is there anything to add from the Nordic perspective on this as well, or nuclear is not really in your sort of area of expertise there? No? Yep.
Well, I can say that in our Bente project, we rely on the government's comments here that they're probably not going to be built.
All right.
In the Baltic countries at least, but maybe other places.
Sure. Okay. Then let's switch back to the renewables because a couple of questions on that coming in. So a couple of people are asking what are the prospects for Nordic-Baltic cooperation in the field of renewable energy. How attractive are the Baltic countries for investments in this sector? Is that something you looked at as well, or is there a cooperation, some synergy that might be gotten out of the regional setting in terms of renewables, or?
Well, it might be a bit specific, at least in the investment part, but I can talk on behalf of the Nordic perspective, which is that in the Nordic countries we have a lot of transmission and cooperation among transmission. And I think that makes it possible to build out the best resource spots for renewable energy.
Right.
And since the Nordic system has been larger and largely coupled with the Baltic system, I think that includes the Baltic into that. And so I think it's important that the Baltic countries use the prime locations for example, wind energy or solar energy as well.
All right. Let me then pick on you more on, so you were quite careful in saying that you have not come to the final conclusions, but nevertheless, you have some idea of what those conclusions might be. So and the Latvian representative there as well sort of put a lot of faith in what you might suggest for, innovative policy ideas. So can you just give us a taste of, is there anything so beyond what I hear across the board in previous presentations as well? So wind energy is huge looking forward. Prosumer sort of tactics important going forward. But anything else, something we have not heard yet about? Anything, revolutionary?
I think I would emphasize building renovation, which has all been mentioned, but from our other study, the Nordic Energy Technology Perspectives, we find that about 70% of all the buildings in 2050 have already been built today. And I guess it would be about the same in the Baltic countries. So deep energy renovation of existing buildings will be a huge or very important step in moving forward on energy efficiency.
All right, good. So we have time for sort of concluding a couple of remarks. So anything really to that you have maybe heard today that sort of rings a bell and improves your thinking and sort of informs your attitude to what shall be done, or any suggestions going forward for the Baltic states in particular? I might be interested in the Latvian perspective as well. You said that the plan is being developed, but at the same time, perhaps you have some ideas what would be the primary areas in which you might achieve that decarbonization beyond renovation. Obviously, renovation is good, but in terms of electricity production, maybe you see some, most important. So let's, if we could move from that side over there, a couple of sentences for each to finish this off.
Okay, our thinking is that for renewables, further or future state aid should be more or less market orientated, yeah? And we are currently thinking about auctioning as one of the possible best solutions. One more thing I would like to say is that regional cooperation with Baltic countries will be very important, since in current review of Renewable Energy Resources Directive, also support openings of state support schemes is kind of near future. So I think that we will closely cooperate with our closest neighbors in that regard too.
Okay, thank you.
I would like to echo Andrei's point that it's all about collaboration, and I'd like to bring this point of view that's maybe very natural to small countries, that we are a small country, but when looking to 2050, then Europe will be 5% of global population. So in 2050, well, already now, Europe is a small part of the world. So working together makes sense with our closest neighbors in the Baltic states, also with the Nordic region and wider Europe, because to really achieve decarbonization, we have to work together, and also to have competitiveness in our industry. It makes sense because we are competing with much bigger players than Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Important remark there. Please, yeah, tell us.
Yes, from Lithuanian perspective, of course, also echo the colleagues from Latvia and Estonia that cooperation is really important. And the study which Kevin is coordinating is about cooperating Baltic countries and Nordics. So yes, I do agree with that. But from one more perspective, that when we were thinking of targets for 2050, 2030, of course we were looking at the forecasts of international energy organizations. We looked at the current trends. And I'm quite happy to be in this conference and to hear that everybody is talking about this. I haven't heard some radically different vision, that everybody is speaking about the need of renewables, about decentralization. So I would stress technology. Technology, again, because to reach the targets we have set, technology breakthrough is really needed in energy.
All right.
It's technology.
Well, in the really long perspective, I would say that management of bioresources and electrification might be the two most important ways to decarbonize the energy sector. And I would also say from the Nordic perspective that energy interdependence might be one of the most cost-efficient ways to utilize the resources best, as opposed to a solo or dependence way of thinking.
Okay, good.
Well, first of all, impossible to disagree with anything that has been said there. I think a further point that may have come out from a few speakers earlier, and which seems to be coming more and more to the forefront, is the digital aspect of everything, and using big data, having smart systems, using the digitalization really to be able to better integrate renewable energy, have smarter systems, demand-side management, and so forth. So that might be one of those technologies that can cut across various areas and help us achieve a smarter system.
Okay, good. I think that nicely concludes our panel here today. We have to break for coffee now. Let us give a good round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much. And let us be back, please, in a half an hour, 3:15. We will talk here about entrepreneurs' side of this. So what can the businesses and companies and innovation in that area do for decarbonization efforts? So thank you very much.